Hello everyone, I am your host, Walt Schamel, with the Florida Aviation Network. We are broadcasting live from the Aerospace Discovery section of the Florida Air Museum in the Sun and Fun Complex in Lakeland, Florida. This is the 41st annual Fly-In and Exposition. Our guest today is Mike Adams with Avemco Insurance. Hi Mike. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
One of the things that you do is sell aviation insurance, and that's probably your primary insurance, isn't it?
Actually, with Avemco, that's our only insurance. We started in 1961. We've been in business since then. We're the only direct writer of insurance in the U.S., which means that the customer deals directly with the insurance company, Avemco, versus going through an agency. But we specialize in aviation insurance. We often get comments from customers about, well, why don't you offer this type of coverage on this airplane? We have a particular niche that we want to work in, and we offer probably a more variety of coverages for a wider variety of pilot experience or types of aircraft than any other insurance company. Now, I can't say that's a guarantee because I don't know the other insurance companies, but yes, we specialize in it. We handle experimental amateur built. We'll write the LSA market. We'll write the pressurized twin market and smaller. We're primarily a piston engine insurance market. And then we also offer several non-owned aircraft coverages for individuals such as myself that may be in a flying club or may rent from a local FBO or flight school on that. We also work with the National Association of Flight Instructors and underwrite their program for the CFI program, which a little later we can get into talking about how do we cover helicopters, and we can address that.
Sounds like you cover the broad spectrum of all the aviation activity and general aviation.
That is correct. Yeah.
The insurance coverage, it's not required by the FARs. And the FAA kind of looks the other way. As long as it has all the FAA requirements, it says insurance, well, that's your problem. And that's where you come in, explaining to the pilots their need for that, even though it's not required. Go ahead.
That is correct. There are only about 5 states in the U.S. that require any kind of proof of insurance in order to register an airplane within their state. And then even those states have variations. If you put your plane down into storage, as an example, you're not flying during the winter, then you don't have to have proof of insurance on it. But of the other 45 states in the nation, there's no requirement for any insurance. A lot of pilots do get the FARs and an insurance policy confused. They're actually two totally different operations on it. And I do make a presentation. I'll be making one at noon today on the CFAA building about some insurance myths and what it can cost you as far as if you assume one thing under an FAR, how does it apply to insurance and vice versa. But the insurance policy is written with the intent, how do we defend the assets of our customer, how do we settle a claim, and how do we take care of the injured party or the plaintiff if they've suffered bodily injury or property damage, or in the event of a business that's damaged, a loss of income. And that's how we write the policy and underwrite our reasons on that. Now, that kind of brings up the question of, well, the FAA only requires a sign-off to fly a certain type of an airplane. But we as the insurance industry, or Avemco in this case, may require some additional time and a specific sign-off in that airplane. And the whole reason is that, one, we know it'll, from our experience, it'll cut down the accident rate on the plane. And we also know that it'll allow us a better defense of you and your assets so that we can get a settlement for you in the event something does go wrong.
I know, reading FAA statistics, they say that the average pilot, whoever that may be, only flies 25 hours a year. How in the world does a person maintain proficiency and currency if they only fly 25 hours a year? And you're involved in the safety program.
Yeah, the 25 hours a year matches somewhat what we found with our customer base on it. Now, the thing that with averages it's always slightly misleading is you can have someone that's flying 200 hours a year, and you have someone that goes out and every 90 days they look at their calendar and say, I've got to go do 3 takeoffs and landings to stay current. So that's how we get our average. But what we've started to encourage, and actually we promote it and work with the FAA Wings program, is an annual recurrency, more so than the biannual flight review or the old flight review. And we give a credit, and we encourage a knowledge course every year, and that every year that you go out and fly with an instructor doing something that is related to your type of flying an aircraft. So if you've got a tailwheel airplane, and let's say that you don't fly during the winter because it's too cold, it's an old J3 Cub, you don't have much of a heater in there, but in the springtime when the winds start blowing in with March, that you go out with an instructor, practice your crosswind landings and takeoffs so that when you do go out and fly, you are current and competent for the trip. One of the advices I give to customers, and I had to follow up myself when my daughters got into college, is if you don't have the money to fly regularly, go ahead and stop, but before you go out and fly again, get with an instructor and go up and make sure that your skills haven't atrophied. One thing that always amazes me is the individual that has a crosswind landing or something, and we start looking into it, and it turns out that the person hasn't flown for 3 to 5 months during the winter. And what they were doing is they were going to go out and practice and get their skills good before they went with an instructor so that the instructor would think they were a good pilot. And I'm saying that's just backwards of what we want. You want to go out with the instructor to keep you out of trouble because they'll make you a good pilot. You don't become a good pilot on your own. So one of our sayings for anyone that remembers politics of the Midwest, and this will date me, is the old, vote early, vote early, vote often, is train early, train often, and that's the mantra that we promote.
And it's a good one because I find it, with me, I never quite fly the airplane as precisely as I should when I'm alone as when I'm with an instructor watching me. And shouldn't be that way, but that's human nature.
Yes.
We give ourselves a little more slack, and somebody needs to once in a while talk to us. And part of it is not just flying, and you brought that up. A lot of it is getting into the books. It's the groundwork before we fly.
Yes.
A lot of pilots seem to skip that, and they forget. And sometimes we see in the accident reports that they didn't know how a system properly worked or how the system failed and to fix it in flight. Human nature. We got to do this. The airlines do recurrent training. The air taxi system does recurrent training. And Part 91, General Aviation, we're into recurrent training too. And the FAA has all kinds of safety programs that they can go to, and they're free.
Correct.
And yours is too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you see in the accident incident realm when it comes to accidents that pilots make, aircraft problems perhaps, that's covered by your insurance?
Well, the leading cause of claims or accidents now this is insurance statistics from Avemco, that the leading cause of accidents or claims we pay has to do with loss of control on landing. And that's regardless of whether it's a tailwheel, fixed gear tricycle, retractable, multi-engine on there. It's loss of control on landing. It can be tailwinds, running off the end of the runway, hitting off to the side, landing short, etc. So the main thing is if pilots could learn to land properly or control their airplane or make the decision that I've got a strong crosswind here, I can't handle the crosswind on it, the POH says that the plane can handle it, but my skills aren't up to it, divert to an alternate airport until the winds are such that you can come back to your home airport on there. If we could eliminate that loss of control on landing, we could have a real positive reduction of insurance premiums because we'd have eliminated for Avemco about 28% of our claims. And again, that has to do with the currency and complacency with the aircraft.
I understand that problem. 10-hour flight, the whole flight is graded on that one landing.
Absolutely.
I see that all the time in the airlines. And you go into Chicago, and it's a challenge, even in the big airplanes.
Yes.
And when you were talking about the tail dragger type airplanes, they're a little more sensitive to crosswinds. And I used to live in Alaska, and when the wind would blow, you'd see airplanes doing that extra turn on the runway before they taxied off.
Yes.
So what's the importance of working with a CFI in your experience about make and model aircraft?
Well, what we've found, and again, looking at our claims, is that owners of aircraft that will work with a CFI that has specific knowledge of that aircraft have a lower accident rate, less likely to have an accident. And so we really promote, and I'm going to throw out a couple names here, the BPPP, the BPT, the Comanche Society, anyone that's got type-specific training and CFIs that are knowledgeable in that aircraft, we really recommend and promote that pilots take the time and the effort to get into that type of an airplane, because that's a CFI that's going to know that aircraft. Now, not to say anything negative about the FAA, but a CFI that's got a single-engine land rating can train in any single-engine land aircraft, even though they may not have any time in that particular plane. And so, my comment to our customers is that you really want to get an instructor that truly does know more about your airplane than you do. So if you're new to an airplane that's kind of unusual, I'll pick on a Piper Comanche as an example. They're great airplanes. We insure quite a few of them. But they do have some unique characteristics. So the CFI that says, oh, I can check you out in a Comanche because I've got some Piper Aero time, that's not really the case. There are some emergency procedures and systems, as you brought up earlier, that are different in the PA-24 versus the PA-28. And we found that when you get the instructor up there, that they may gloss over an emergency procedure that can make a difference between a gear-up landing and a non-gear-up landing in the event of an emergency. With the Comanche is that you want that instructor that's going to make you really sweat. No. Actually, if you could find the instructor that you had to do a clean laundry of your shirt each time you flew with them, that would be the instructor that you want, because they're really going to make you a better pilot. And some pilots will go out and they'll take a look at it and say, well, I've got to get the flight review, so I'm going to find the instructor that'll sign me off with the least amount of effort. I want to do my minimum of the 3 hours to get it. You're wasting 3 hours essentially. Get an instructor that'll make you work and really make you a better pilot. And we promote and support that.
I understand. I do fly seaplanes, and I fly with a lot of people that fly float planes. And when they're flying float planes, and then they jump into the lake amphibian, which is a monohull airplane, a flying boat, got the engine up on top. It's a good airplane, and it's well built, but it has different flying characteristics. And as you mentioned earlier, they fly floats all the time. Then in the spring or whenever, they jump into the lake amphibian, and they say, well, I'm a current seaplane pilot. You may be current, but you're not proficient. And if you're not proficient with a capital P, you're not safe.
Correct.
Get an instructor and review.
Yes.
The FAA Wings program, you talked about that. And you talked about it being related into the underwriting and premium. How does that affect the cost to a pilot?
Okay. Well, I can speak specifically to Avemco and the way we handle it. We give a premium credit for anyone that keeps the Wings program current, and it comes in two parts. We give 5% premium credit each year for completion of a knowledge course, which is part of the Wings program, and then a 5% credit for completion of the flight training portion of the Wings. So as long as one of our customers keeps their Wings current, they can earn up to a 10% premium credit off of the standard policy. And we looked into this several years ago. It's been about 7 years we've been doing this. And we did find, again, that those that trained regularly had a little bit better accident rate, and therefore we could adjust our premium to reflect that. So we do bring that up with all the customers we talk to. We stress it at the programs that we put on. We include that in our On Approach magazine that we put out. We promote it on our website. So we do want pilots to train. Now, we'd like to insure everyone. We understand that some of the competitors will insure some of the customers or people we'd like to insure, but we still promote the training and that everyone should do that. And I have noticed that some of the other companies seem to, or at least agencies, seem to be implying now that other companies will give some recognition and credit for continuous training in the specific aircraft.
There's been some impetus in that area of consistent training. The FAA Wings program it's an annual requirement, but in reality, the individual pilot probably should have his own personal training program to be maybe once a quarter. And like you say, take an instructor out. It's well worth the money. And if the instructor works you, they've earned their money.
Absolutely.
You're coming up on a safety seminar in Idaho. What's your topic?
The topic will be one that's kind of near and dear to our heart, and also the FAA. The title is What Kind of Pilot Runs Out of Gas? It's pretty interesting. It has three different scenarios where everything was done absolutely right, but the results weren't what you would have expected or wanted. The good news is that in these scenarios, no one is injured. A couple of airplanes are destroyed, though. And all turns out well in the end. But it does point out how you can look at the pilot operating handbook, you can do your pre-flight, how you can get complacent again and not use a checklist and get yourself into trouble, although when you initially took off, everything should have worked out just fine. So it's an interesting topic. The places that I've presented it back here on the East Coast, it's almost like a travel log for the pilots back here because it gives you an introduction to flying in the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies of Montana, the Oregon Cascades of Western Oregon. For pilots in Idaho, the stories are still good. The terrain may not be quite so new to them because they've been flying there all along. But it is a program that we put on. It does qualify for the Wings Knowledge course, and so we're happy to support shows and make that presentation because it is an interesting topic. One other topic while I've got the floor here, because eventually someone always asks, well, what can we do to help make sure I don't have a claim or an insurance claim? And from an insurance point of view, I talked about the loss of directional control on landing being the majority of our losses. Another claim that we see with irritating regularity are taxi losses. Now you stop and think from your primary pilot training, you never taxi faster than a fast walk. You pay attention, you watch your shadows, you watch your wingtips. If you're not sure you can make it, you're supposed to shut down, get out, take a look, maybe pull it through with a tug. We have an alarming number of taxi losses where we think that shouldn't happen. And I'm going to put you on the spot here for a minute. I'm going to give you 3 pilot categories, and you're going to tell me which group you think has the highest taxi loss. Student pilots through 100 hours, 101 hours to 250 hours, more than 250 hours.
Wow, now you put me on the spot.
Yes, I have.
I got to pick A, B, or C. Do
Correct.
I get to ask the audience which one?
You can if you want. You can if you want.
I'm going to take a guess that it's going to be the higher one because the student pilot's in constant training at the time and they're working with an instructor. So I would think that the 100 to the 250 hour might be the one. However, to shade it a little bit, I've seen on television recently where airliners have been getting together on the taxiways and on the ramp.
Yes, yeah. Well, come by the booth, I'll give you an Avemco hat. You're the first person that's actually gotten it right the first time around. Student pilots, that 0 to 100, have a very low taxi loss rate for the exact reason you're saying. They're terrified of doing something wrong. They've got an instructor generally looking around at it. Now, occasionally we do get a taxi loss where we end up with the instructor and the student both inside the airplane looking at avionics or something. But yeah, the ace of the base, the more than the 250-hour pilot and stuff, where you think they'd have no taxi losses, they're right in there with the general mix. And we think it's a combination of complacency, multitasking, getting distracted by avionics or something like that. Or if you're a runner pilot, and this is stealing a quote from Rod Machado, we fear the runaway Hobbs meter. And so we start the airplane, we know we're paying for a 60-minute hour on that rental, and boy, if we can dial something in, get our taxi clearance or our approval to taxi, then we're going to do 2 at the same because we know that Hobbs meter is costing us, money. And that's where we start to get into trouble. So we've now traded the Hobbs meter money for the deductible on a claim or having to pay for a loss of revenue if it's a rental type aircraft. So, pay attention while you're taxiing. Don't taxi faster than a walk. If you're in question about the clearance, get out and check it, and please don't multitask. When you're taxiing, you should taxi. When you're setting up your avionics, stop and set up your avionics.
I'm afraid that I suffered from part of that. I was at the Nut Tree in California back in the old days, and there was a narrow taxiway, trees on both sides, and an airplane's coming out, and it's kind of a one-way system. The line boy comes running out, and he's going to give me the hand signals to taxi over to the side so the other airplane can get by. And I'm following him, and I didn't do my job as a pilot because the pilot's always responsible.
Absolutely.
And even though I was barely moving, watching the ground handler, quote unquote, the airplane rocked to a stop. And I looked at him, and he's motioning me to come on, come on. And I looked down the right wing, and there's a tree growing through it.
Wow.
And all I did was dent the leading edge a little bit, but I was upset. And I shut down and I got out and going to move it by hand over to the parking area. And the first thing he says, well, don't blame me. I didn't have anything to do with it.
Yep.
And I said, you're absolutely right. It's my fault.
Yeah.
So, working with flying clubs. I know you're involved in the Wings program.
Right.
You're involved with the public presentations. What do you do specifically or different, if anything, with flying clubs?
Well, with the flying clubs, we set our minimums for the policy contract, and again, we write it so that we can protect our insureds and pay the claims. We encourage flying clubs to institute their own type of annual or 6-month recurrency for their pilots that fly the airplane on there. And a lot of clubs have done that, and they've calculated that if they can cut down their accident rate, one, it controls the premiums that the flying club's going to pay, and it also keeps their planes flying. There's nothing more irritating, I would imagine, for other members, is if you've got one airplane in the club, someone has a mishap and it's out of service for 6 months being repaired. Well, you know, there's the other, if we have a 10-member club, there's the other 9 members that can't fly for 6 months because of the actions of one pilot. So we do promote that they do some internal training on that, that it's specific to their types of aircraft. As the flying club airplane gets more complex, we do put in some recurrency requirements in our pilot clause having to do with a 180-day flight experience or a checkout in the last 45 days prior to the operation of the airplane. And we have found that a lot of the organizations and clubs, particularly if they have multiple aircraft, have experienced a little bit better loss ratio, a decrease in claims, when they've started to enforce a recurrency in the club aircraft by all of their members. And that works on a couple of levels. One, it makes sure the pilots are current and qualified for the flight involved. And if you want to think about human nature, it also sets a standard that'll attract a certain type of pilot. If a pilot is applying for membership in a club, and right up front they know that, hey, every 6 months I'm going to have to go out and fly with a club CFI, or I'm going to have to take a knowledge course, or I'm going to have to keep a wings current, that's going to attract that type of pilot that says, I believe in training, I believe in safety, and I'm going to adhere to it. Meanwhile, the type of pilot that says, well, wait a minute, I only want to do the bare minimums to be current every 90 days, every 2 years of flight review, and they decide not to join that particular club, that's almost a benefit to the club and the self-selection of competent, qualified carrying pilots and owners.
There was a flying club called Sky Roamers in Southern California several years ago, and their requirements were very strenuous. Once a year, you had to take an instructor out and go for a 10-hour cross-country someplace so they could see your entire flight planning and your judgment, your decision-making. See whether it was appropriate to flying their aircraft, and they went from Cessna 150s to multi-engine airplanes and much more complex. Speaking of flying clubs, the military has a lot of flying clubs, but all the military clubs are operated under Part 91. Do you work with the flying clubs specifically?
The military flying clubs?
Yes.
I know that we did extensively in the past. If you were to ask me to try and name a military flying club that we insure right now, I'd be at a loss to do that. We insure somewhere around 750 flying clubs overall, and I'm sure some of them may be tied in with a military operation. I'm just not familiar with it. But anytime you can set standards and introduce some sort of regimen into the operations of the airplane that would come with a military club, that's going to be a good operation.
Well, most of the military clubs, they're just a flying club with military members, and they have certain requirements. And usually the base commander or wing commander is the sponsor of the club, and they kind of keep an eye on it, make sure that it continues to be safe. But one of the things is the aircraft is insured. The club carries insurance. The fixed base operator, if you rent one, they carry insurance, but it doesn't cover the pilot and passengers, does it?
It may or may not. It depends on how it's written. Don't ever assume that you've got coverage from someone else. We used to joke in insurance, and still do periodically, that he who pays the gold has the coverage. And if you're not paying anything for it, you may not have the coverage. Most flight schools are set up on the basis where you are correct. It's for the protection of the flight school and their business operations and does not extend to the liability of the renter pilot. Think of it like your Avis or Hertz or economy car rental on there. Their policy protects their business. It doesn't protect you as the driver. You need something else. So we do offer a non-owned insurance policy that is carried by the individual. It's relatively inexpensive, and it travels with them in any non-owned aircraft that they fly. So let's say that you join this open pilot program and you're traveling, you can rent from different flight schools. Once you've got the non-owned policy, it'll cover you in any of those locations in any of the airplanes. And the definition of the non-owned airplane is actually pretty broad. Under ours, very quickly, it's 7 seats or less, single engine. The engine can be up to 450 horsepower, land-based, standard certificated, or in the SLSA aircraft or glider category. So if you have a non-owned policy and you have access to rent a tailwheel aircraft like a J3 Cub or a Cessna 170, you're covered in that. You pick up a 172 or a 182, you're covered in that. Piper Arrow, you're covered in that. If you're going to get into the multi-engine, we do look at that a little bit differently and have a different rating structure for it, but we can cover multi-engine aircraft. So if you do fly with a flying school or a flying club, the question to ask on this, rather than are these planes insured, is am I personally insured while flying this aircraft? And if the answer is I'm not sure, then you ought to look into a non-owned policy for yourself. If they say yes, the policy is written by, and here's a tout for Avemco, if it's an Avemco Flying Club policy, we insure the club and the individual members while operating the club aircraft. So they are personally insured under our policy. They don't need a non-owned policy in that situation.
And probably a good idea for the club member is to get a copy of that insurance policy and keep it in their records.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Make sure that they're named insured.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of named insured, we've talked about airplanes. What about those funny machines that have 2,000 parts in loose formation, a helicopter?
Okay.
How about those?
Well, helicopters are part of the aviation community, and for a long time, flight instructors had trouble getting personal CFI coverage to instruct in rotorcraft. So Avemco, in working with the National Association of Flight Instructors, we've recently added non-owned rotorcraft to the coverage that the CFI can purchase from us. So if you are a CFI, you're instructing in a piston-powered rotorcraft on there and you need some personal insurance or protection, we can set that up for you. Again, that's a new product. We brought that out in January, and there may be just one other company that offers it. I'm not even sure of that, but we've got a very broad policy for that.
Well, thank you, Mike. Mike Adams with Avemco Insurance. And we're very glad you were able to be with us to help celebrate Sun and Fun's 41st anniversary, Mike. And thank you for joining us with the Florida Aviation Network, and we'll see you the next time.